Alright, in this lecture we're going to be talking about the unifying themes of biology and maybe a little intro to cell biology. In biology, you do need to learn from the book and from here uh, what the unifying themes are. The first one is evolution. Alright, so evolution, it's how organisms are related, essentially. Evolution is all about the idea that there was some original organism or a few original organisms, and they multiplied, and over time these organisms mutated. Their DNA changed, so therefore their physical characteristics changed, and they moved to different places. And the idea is that the ones that had changes that were better adapted to those places, they thrived and they had more children, so therefore those changes became dominant in that area, and they have what's called a niche, and they are designed to live in that area under those environmental conditions. Here we have an example of a mouse that is this particular color, and that's because it lives on like sand, all right, a beach mouse, and so it's the color of sand so that predators can't see it. Here we have an inland mouse, and it's darker, all right, because it lives on darker soil or on rocks. And this is the concept of evolution, and there are what we call evolutionary biologists. These themes that we have here often those are the branches of biology. Now, I am primarily an evolutionary biologist and what we call a molecular biologist, which is down here in the DNA. So I kind of move in between these two, maybe a little bit over here. I don't get into the ecology down here or the environmentalism. These are two different fields, but here we have the evolution. And of course, these days, at one time, I should say, at one time you studied just what the organisms look like because we didn't know how to study the DNA. Today, we primarily look at the DNA, and then we go and look how that DNA affects the appearance of the organism, like these mice. But originally, we just could look at the mice, and we could breed them, and we'll learn all about the history of how we did that, and then how we eventually moved into being able to study the DNA, which is the actual, what we call, if we had a theory about how things worked here, we went and then tried to confirm that with the DNA, and everyone, of course, now understands the DNA is what controls everything about the organism. So we use this data over the original data where we didn't have all this underlying information about the genes. But at one time we just had, all we could do is breed these mice and see what the children look like. Today we can go look at the DNA. So today we know a lot more than we did just 20 or 30 years ago. We've multiplied our amount of information by a thousandfold, I bet. Now over here is tissues, organs. This is where more like medicine comes into biology. It's how the organism is structured, all right? And one of the themes of this course is structure and function. We need to understand that these structures have a shape, they have chemical properties, and whatever their structure is, it often leads to their function, and we need to connect those two ideas. So remember that concept that structure leads to function, and that'll be more of something we talk about when we're talking about cells and how organisms are formed, that sort of thing. We will of course talk a lot about genetics in this course, and I want to point out now that maybe here when we talk about this, we shouldn't talk so much about genes, and probably we should just say DNA. Oops, I'm not very good at writing here with a mouse. Alright, we should probably replace this with DNA because the definition of a gene is undergoing a change right now. And I like this book because it does take a lot of that into account. But I will tell you exactly what the old definition of a gene was and the new. And this book is open to the idea of the new definition, but these ideas change, and as I think I mentioned in the last lecture, uh, with hitting your leg with the stick, uh, the ideas behind how things work change over time as we learn more. And our definition of a gene is very rapidly changing. We're beginning to realize that it's really not what we classically called the gene that affects so much evolution and your appearance, as it is the DNA that regulates the genes. And we'll talk about that. And some people say that maybe we should expand the definition of a gene to include more than just the old concept of a gene, but this new DNA we need, and some of these other properties, and combine these things into maybe a new gene version of a gene, or some people are calling it a genetic unit, instead of just, there's the old classical gene which will be part of a genetic unit. And so we'll talk about that a lot at the end of this course. But it's very important, if you are a biology major, to understand how the concept of a gene is changing. And I think all of you will find that interesting, just how much we do know now, and how really interesting it is. Now down here is more of your ecology and environmentalism. Now these are also forms of biology. You might include biochemistry in here, but we're doing a lot more chemistry and physics down here. So how does energy go to one organism and then pass to another? So we cycle energy. There's a flow of energy from, at least on Earth, from the sun to usually something like a plant, which is a producer, which produces things like sugars and such, which are consumed by usually an animal, which then might be eaten by other animals. But eventually the energy cycles through these organisms, as well as the matter. We're going to talk a lot about water, and we're going to talk a lot about carbon, and there are other elements that are also cycled through our ecosystems, and those we need to talk about that. So there's a little chemistry there, a little bit environmental understanding of how these things flow, and little physics. But we need to understand that energy and certain elements, matter, flow through these organisms, and there are cycles, and we can study these cycles and figure out how these organisms interact, which moves us over here to the true interaction between organisms. Here we have this hawk or something coming down to catch this little mouse. And this, of course, is ecology. It's the understanding of how these organisms interact with one another. And we will talk a little bit about this. That is not the primary focus of this course, but we do talk about it. The primary focus of this course are, of course, up here in these three. Evolution is not one of the focuses of this. For this course, our primary focus is in the organization and the information. So we will focus in these two primary groups in this course. In the second semester, you do a lot more of the other three. You look at the evolution, the interactions, and the energy flow. You do a little bit of this, and not so much of the information anymore. But this course, we're primarily looking at these two right here. So let's move on to the next little picture I have. These are pictures from the book, by the way. This is not where I do the PowerPoints. I will do an entire, the end of, when I get through all of this little subjects that I want to talk about, which are kind of like my in-class lecture. I will make a video using the PowerPoints, which covers all of the topics in the book that might be covered on an exam. And my exams, though, almost always come from these parts, not from the book. So that's a little hint of what's important. These lectures are far more important than the PowerPoints or the book. But if you're trying to get that 100%, 95 and above, then you're going to need to also go to the book. All right, so what types of things are we looking at what kind of processes or things do we look at in order to study these, well, there are several concepts that we need to understand. Life is ordered, it's organized. Cells are structured in a certain way, petals. And this is where we get this structure leads to function again. We also have adaptation. Look at this little seahorse. It has adapted itself to look like the coral that it lives in so that things can't see it. It blends in. And so this particular little seahorse has designed itself to blend in and not get caught and eaten by other things. And if it moves away from that coral, it's going to get eaten because it's definitely going to stand out anywhere else except for here. All right, and that's called evolutionary adaptation. Now, regulation, and you're going to go, what does regulation have to do with this picture? We have this rabbit, and he has really big ears. What's the regulation part? Well, this is not actually talking about like gene regulation or something like that. It's actually talking about these ears. These ears allow this rabbit to regulate its temperature. It can radiate heat. It's a desert animal, and it needs to get rid of heat efficiently. And those ears let it cool off easily. So the idea here is that this is all about temperature regulation, and this is a concept. So there are all types of regulation systems in your body. At the molecular level, it's things that regulate your genes that I just mentioned. But in the larger scale of the organism, you have to regulate things like how much water you have and the heat. And this one is all about regulating the heat inside the body of the rabbit. All right, so energy processing. This is about eating. This is metabolism, and we will talk. I'll have a lecture or two on metabolism. And you eat things, and you break it down into things that you can utilize to rebuild your body, and you also get energy. Of course, this also creates wastes, and we also have to talk about how you get rid of those wastes. And so that's metabolism and energy processing. All right, growth and development. Organisms don't start out full grown. They have to grow and develop. Very complex process. The exception to this rule might be bacteria. Bacteria kind of, they do what's called fission, and they essentially one breaks into two smaller bacteria. And that doesn't really consider growth and development. It's really just boom, you're two organisms now. And but in something like us, what we call a eukaryote, we do grow and develop, and these are usually in reference to organisms that have many cells, not just one. A bacteria is a single-celled organism, where it's a single cell. Now they grow in colonies and things like that, but they're all individual organisms. Whereas humans, like ourselves and most of the other organisms we're aware of, are multicellular, and these cells live together to form a much larger macroscopic organism, such as ourselves, versus a microscopic organism like a bacteria. So the idea here is this growth and development is very important. We'll spend a great deal of time talking about this and how genes, what we were talking about, how those genes are regulated to accomplish this. How can you have so many different types of cells, but they all have the same genes? And that's true. And we'll talk about how those genes are regulated to form a macroscopic organism. A response to the environment. So all organisms need some method to kind of sense the environment so that they can survive. They have to respond in order to obtain food, to mate, to run away from predators, that sort of thing. So you have to have senses, some method of responding. In the case of the little microscopic bacteria, its senses are chemical in nature, so it senses the chemistry, perhaps the light, but nothing more than that. So you'll have lots of chemical senses there. We have a lot of senses, everything from touch to smell to sight. Smell is chemical, taste is chemical, sight, which is the sensing of light, touch, which is from physical contact, things like that. And we respond in a particular way to the environment. And this is one of the concepts that we need to understand. And then, of course, reproduction, and you have to understand how and why organisms reproduce. Why don't we just live forever? Well, it's to induce a little bit of change so that we have variety, because we find that the environment changes slowly or quickly, and the organisms that live in it have to adapt to it. And so the organisms have to change as well. And so we have mutations, which lead to differences in all of us. All of us are slightly different, and those differences are the result of mutations from some ancestor we had, and their descendants. And slowly these mutations, groups of mutations, can come together to reform the organism so that it doesn't look anything like its ancestor. Here, of course, we have giraffes, and the child will not be exactly like the parent, as we've grown to understand, even with humans. But those differences sometimes are an advantage, sometimes they're a disadvantage. When they're a disadvantage, the child is more likely to not survive or not have as many children, and therefore it is not well adapted to the current environment, and therefore those changes are not passed on. And this is what we really call natural selection. And we will talk about natural selection, and we will relate it to evolution. They are not the same thing, but they are. You have to understand one to understand the other one. So natural selection we can demonstrate in the laboratory. Evolution you cannot demonstrate. Evolution is something that happens over millions of years, and unless somebody invents a time machine, it's really hard to prove evolution. Natural selection, on the other hand, very provable. You can do experiments, you can show that it exists. So we'll talk a lot about the difference between natural selection and evolution. Moving on to the third one. Here we have a cell. Now, actually, we have two cells. This is a eukaryote. These are the type of cells we have. All right. And here's a little bacteria. Now, the difference between the bacteria and the eukaryotic cells, we call these prokaryotes. So here you see prokaryote, here you see eukaryote. So eukaryote, these are ours, and these cells can be vastly different, but they all have the same DNA. So the DNA in here in the nucleus, all right, it will be the same, all right, and they have a lot of DNA. And the difference between our cells, say a skin cell and a liver cell or a neuron, the difference is they use different parts of the DNA. All of the information is there for making all of our cells, but in certain cells you turn certain genes on and certain genes off. And that's what causes the cell to be a different type of cell. The information is there to be all the other different types of cells, but it's just not being utilized. In comparison to the bacteria, which is a single-celled organism, it's not part of a big macro organism that has many cell types. It's just all by itself, and it doesn't have much DNA, and it uses all of it. All right, you don't turn genes on and off in a bacteria. They're pretty much all on. There is a sort of off in there, but we won't talk about it. So you just kind of generally assume that all of their genes are ready to go and they're on, and they're very tiny. The difference in the sizes between these two can be up to 10,000 times. So the largest eukaryotic cell versus the smallest bacteria, that would be like 10,000 times bigger. So if this were 10,000, this would be just a little dot here somewhere, and it wouldn't compared to this eukaryotic cell. So just realize this is not size accurate. This one is smaller, but it's typically much smaller than a eukaryotic cell like we have. And in fact, these things are thought to have, at one point, something called the endosymbiotic theory, to move inside a larger cell and learn to live, and that's the origin of the mitochondria. And that's a theory we will learn in future lectures. So it's really interesting that we think that at one time a bacteria moved into our cells and set up camp, and the bacteria have been living inside ever since, and that is what a mitochondria is, and there's good reason to believe that that is indeed what happened, and it's a really interesting theory that we will talk about. So I want you to know here the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We will have a whole lecture on this. There's a story I'm going to tell you called the Apartment and Mansion Story, and that will kind of give us an idea of the differences and the abilities, how the abilities change between one of these cells and one of these cells. These are the bacteria called prokaryotes. These are the eukaryotes, and they're like us. They're typically multicellular organisms. Not always, but most of the time they're going to be multicellular, as in they're going to have lots of different cell types, and they're all going to live together as a single organism. All right, moving on to the last slide, we have DNA. This is one of the other main themes. All organisms have not only cells, but in those cells, they're going to have DNA, and DNA is where you store the information for making you. For making the organism is essentially in the DNA. Actually, we need to understand that along here, we represent DNA as letters. It's a linear kind of like words. These are chemicals. They're not actually letters, but we think of it because we understand text. So just like you read a book, you can read the DNA, and what it does, they're instructions. They're instructions actually for making proteins. All right, now proteins are a different chemical, what do you want? Just a different chemical. I'll just leave it at that at this point. I don't want to go into the specific chemistry here yet. But these chemicals are read, all right, by a protein, which is actually made from the instructions here, and it's kind of complicated, which came first, the chicken or the egg there. But essentially, these are instructions for making proteins. And the proteins do all of the work and also provide a lot of the structure for your cells. And so you are actually this giant sack of chemicals, these giant sack of proteins, which are constantly doing all this chemical work. All right, they're moving things and changing the pH and pumping things in, pumping things out. And those proteins are doing all this work inside your cell. And they take the energy that they get, and some of the proteins read the DNA and make more proteins. All right, and so ultimately this DNA, these letters here, are like instructions, like a recipe for making the proteins in your cells. So we need to understand that. We need to understand that DNA is in the form of a double helix. We will talk more about that in another lecture. So you need to know it's a double helix. Hopefully you learned that in a different class, but we will talk about it. And you read the DNA, and that DNA is the actual instructions for making proteins, which essentially do everything in your cells. And essentially you are a giant protein factory, your cells are, and those proteins are protected inside the cell to do all this fancy chemistry that produces, in a net effect, when all those cells get together, they produce you. So we need to understand what DNA is and what it does. Essentially, it's just a store of information, and that information is read just like you would read a recipe, and you make the proteins, and the proteins actually do everything. So I will be giving you several lectures probably on something I call Grandma's Cookbook. That'll be on the, I believe, second or third test. Maybe yeah, I get to it somewhere in there. Probably the second test. And we will be talking about Grandma's Cookbook. And Grandma's Cookbook is just taking this concept of this sure does look like an instruction, and then the proteins would be like the food. And so we're going to make the analogy that this DNA here is really a giant cookbook, and the results of that cookbook are you, or at least a cell. And we're going to use that analogy for you to learn something called transcription and translation. That is also very important that you learn those two in this course, because that is the central theme behind all of biology today. Today, biology is driven by this DNA sequence, and everything we do today in biology is we're not as focused anymore on the anatomy or the physiology. If you are into those things, you always kind of have to relate it back to the DNA and the genetics these days. So everything is based on this. So this is, of course, what I will focus on in this class, is making sure that you understand this relationship between the DNA and the proteins. Essentially, it's a story. that I call Grandma's Cookbook. And if you learn that, you'll be in good shape to take future biology classes if you want. All right, that is it for this lecture. I'll be moving forward. This one was just a couple of pictures from the book. You can find all of these pictures. The main thing I would say you need to know here, the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote, and understand the nature of DNA. Understand that these are instructions for making the cell and ultimately making you. And that's the primary thing to get out of this lecture.